Good morning, everyone. The subcommittee will come to order. Welcome to our first budget hearing of the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on Commerce, Justice, and Science and related agencies for this fiscal year 21. Today we have the honor of hearing from the Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, about the President's FY21 funding priorities for the Department of Commerce. Welcome, Secretary Ross. Thank you for your appearance. We look forward to hearing from you this morning. As we know, the Department of Commerce executes a broad range of critical activities for our nation, things that are important to every American, things that are important to us as members of the Senate, and issues that we care a lot about. Research and development, cutting-edge technology, predicting the weather, increasing trade and investment, recruiting businesses to our communities. The decennial census has been a significant component of the Department's business for the last several years. The President's FY21 request for the Department is $8 billion, which is $6.7 billion below the FY20 enacted level, which represents a 44% decrease in the Department's overall budget. While this is a large decrease on paper, much of it is due to in large part to the planned ramp down of the funding of the 2020 census. That said, I am troubled by some of the proposed cuts to core programs that are overshadowed by the magnitude of the reduction to the Census Bureau. While this is a budget hearing about fiscal year 21, we cannot overlook that in under a month, the Department, through the Bureau of Census, will be receiving millions of responses from the public for the decennial census. This committee in Congress have provided funding to ensure the necessary resources are available to conduct a timely and accurate census, and I encourage everyone to fill out their forms. I'm pleased to see that the Department's 21 budget would increase research and development investments in support of Industries for Future initiative. This initiative is important for maintaining the United States' position as a leader in innovation, but I believe we must also recognize that currently more than 90% of the nation's innovation sector growth occurs in only 5 metropolitan areas, all of which are located on the coast. This type of concentration underscores the importance of continued funding for the Department's nationwide economic development programs, which will allow us to expand the geographic extent of the innovation economy and capitalize on the potential for all regions of the country. The Department's budget proposal also includes a $25 million increase to prepare NTIA for testing new wireless networks and advancing spectrum management, which is an important component of us, the United States, winning the 5G race. However, I believe we also must not forget the concerns from communities across the country who are unable to fully access broadband because they either are underserved or unserved. I'm interested to hear how the Department's proposed investments will address this issue as part of this budget request. Mr. Secretary, I applaud you and others in the administration for recent trade-related achievements, including the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement and the Phase 1 trade deal with China. These deals are critical for restoring and stabilizing markets for American exports, which are the lifeblood of the Kansas economy. We are an export state, and these issues matter greatly to me. Although the Department's FY21 budget does not include any specific requests related to these agreements, I would like to hear what role, if any, the Department will have in regard to supporting the trade agreements I just mentioned and the trade agreements that are still contemplated. The Department's Section 232 tariff exclusion process is a large component of the Department's FY21 trade budget. In light of the recent Inspector General Management Alert, which details several concerning irregularities with this process, I have renewed my concerns about the fairness and transparency of the overall execution of Section 232 exclusions. It is beyond time that the Department of Commerce get this process right. Another way that the Department significantly impacts everyday life for local communities and citizens is through the activities of the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. NOAA's weather programs are very important to the people of Kansas, and we regularly experience weather events and water events. I'm pleased that the FY21 request includes full funding of NOAA's flagship weather satellites, but I'm concerned there's a lack of funding to maintain and recapitalize NOAA's core observational assets, including its fleet of aircraft. The Bureau and programs of the Department of Commerce, which I've highlighted here today, and also those which I've not, are unquestionably critical for addressing the needs of our nation. Mr. Secretary, the success of the Department of Commerce depends upon its people, and currently the Department has a people problem. The vacancy rate and the time it takes to hire across many of the department's bureaus has become problematic. For example, EDA has only filled 24 of 55 positions, or 44%, that are responsible for overseeing and executing the nearly $1.2 billion that EDA received in FY18 and 19 for disaster relief. Within the office inside NOAA that is responsible for managing our nation's constellation of weather satellites, there's a 24% vacancy with 243 vacant positions, 132 which have been vacant for over 2 years. The department must ensure its bureaus are sufficiently staffed, and I'm interested in hearing what the Secretary has to say in that regard. Mr. Secretary, again, I thank you for being here. I appreciate the relationship that we have. I look forward to hearing your views on these and other matters during today's hearing. And I now turn to my colleague and friend, the Senator from New Hampshire, Senator Shaheen, for opening. Mr. Secretary, you're right. Short amount of time for a big department with lots of important roles and issues. Let me start my questioning concerning NOAA and aircraft recapitalization. Mr. Secretary, I touched on this in my opening statement. NOAA recently provided this subcommittee with a notional plan to recapitalize its fleet of aircraft. While I recognize that the President's FY21 budget does not include funding for that, I believe that projected obsolescence of NOAA's aircraft demand that we take action to recapitalize those assets. Do you agree that NOAA's fleet of aircraft are in need of recapitalization? And could you elaborate on what those immediate needs for aircraft are?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. NOAA's aircraft recapitalization plan was published in October 2019, and it looked at long-term recapitalization strategy and the management of current aircraft. The plan recommended NOAA procure 2 aircraft based on the 2018 appropriation. Consistent with this plan, NOAA was able to procure 2 additional aircraft, a Gulfstream 550 and a King Air aircraft, utilizing fiscal 2018 appropriations. These aircraft are essential to ensure NOAA maintains the ability to plan for and respond to the nation's most damaging and most deadly weather events, agricultural security and water security. The plan also recommended the future purchase of a 3rd aircraft. That 3rd aircraft is being studied right now, and it would have the primary missions of charting, surveying, and weather forecasting. So that was very likely to be a King Air, but they have not made a final decision as yet.
Mr. Secretary, thank you. I would appreciate it if you would ask if you'd ask your staff to follow up with me, the subcommittee, in regard to the cost to cover that air recapitalization, including that additional King Air.
We'd be delighted to, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Let me turn my attention to trade. And I mentioned this in my opening statement again about USMCA and Phase 1 deal with China. Mr. Secretary, what role will your department play in helping implement, monitor, or enforce USMCA and the Phase 1 trade deal with China? And does the FY21 request support that role?
Well, let me answer the 3rd part first. Yes, the budget request does provide the funding that we need for those roles. The roles we've played so far have been working very closely with USTR to help them develop the want list, the negotiating list, the product list that they've had. Subsequently, we will be dealing with the enforcement of the provisions that are in there. We are very confident that we have the staffing and the expertise to perform those functions, and we're in constant communication as between our office and USTR on those topics.
Secretary, thank you. Let me pursue the Section 232 exclusion process. The President's FY21 budget requests an increase of $3 million within ITA for Section 232 exclusion process, which is based off previous spending reports. I take to mean the total cost to administer the process is going to be roughly $18.5 million in FY21.
Yeah.
Mr. Secretary, is $18.5 million amount that the department, is that the amount the department needs to effectively execute this process? If not, what would you say is required? And as you know, there have been criticisms that were levied against the Section 232 exclusion process by the department's Inspector General in late 2019. And there are members of Congress who certainly are dubious about that process. The second part of my question is, would you assure us today that this process is being executed in a fair, consistent, and transparent fashion?
Well, yes. First of all, as to the Inspector General's comments, there were basically three suggestions he made, all of which we have adopted. So his constructions were well themed, and we have implemented each of them. One was to make sure that any ex parte communiques were posted and made available to everybody involved. Second was to make sure that once we posted a decision, it was regarded as a final decision. Those were the really two big important parts of the Inspector General's recommendation. And we are adhering to those. Once in a while, it does become necessary to correct an error. And so that's the only deviation from regarding the posted decision as final. And what causes that is the huge number of requests that we have received. To date, we have actually received 171,742 exclusion requests. Of those, we've posted 138,243. There have been 31,381 objections filed, and that's an objection rate of about 23%. We've processed 112,819 requests, granted 87,808, denied 25,011, and returned for improper or incomplete filings some 31,553. We have active pending cases, 27,322. Meanwhile, we have achieved a 79% decrease in the initial posting times, and we have achieved a 63% decrease in decision times under the new portal system that we introduced mid-year last year. That has greatly accelerated the processing that we do. On average, the department now posts requests within 3 days of submission. It renders decisions on cases without objection within 59 days of their submission. So what really takes the time are the ones that have objections to them, because that requires going back and forth between the applicant and the objectors to determine whether or not the request meets the requirement of product that is not made in sufficient quantity, sufficient quality, sufficient timeliness to meet the applicant's requirements. So there's a lot of give and take, and that's the variable in the time equation for when objections are raised. When there are objections, in the case of steel, we have granted the exclusion in 18.8% of the cases, and in the case of aluminum, despite objection, we have granted the exclusion in 21% of the cases. So more or less 20% of the time when there have been objections, it's proven that they were not well-founded, and therefore we granted the exclusion request in any event.